All right, well, Dr. Kevin Donnelly, thank you for joining us on Based Podcast. I always introduce guests by giving them their Based credentials, and you're certainly well qualified for that. You've led the fight on education for years on end, and thanks for being with us. And in fact, you started your career as an educator. I'm just interested in a bit of the background, and from there you've sort of morphed into politics and done some work at the ACU, and you're of course a prolific author and writer. So, but right back to the beginning, you started right in the classroom. Tell us about what it was like in the days when you started.
Well, that's a fair while ago now, and thank you for having me on the show. But a bit of background. I grew up in Broadmeadows in Melbourne, and it was a working class area, and that no problem. I mean, we never knew we were victims back then. We just got on with life and did the best we could and worked hard. But the teachers at the local school, Broadmeadows High School, were brilliant teachers, and they introduced a lot of us to our history, our culture, our literature, our science. So we had a very good grounding in our education back then. It's very different now, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But a lot of the teachers were like mentors to me. And so I ended up doing an undergraduate degree at La Trobe University, then a diploma of education. And so I started teaching around about 1975 and taught for 18 years in secondary schools around Melbourne, government and non-government. I went back and did a master's and a PhD, a doctorate, looking at curriculum and education more broadly, trying to work out where we were going wrong and what we should do. So, yeah, I taught for 18 years, went back, did postgrad, and that really started me on this journey of, as you have, fighting the battle of ideas, as John Howard calls it.
And it's been a sort of a journey from there into, as I say, into politics, but also into, really getting down on paper, I think, what some of the problems are. What's been if you look at the curriculum back, let's say, when you first entered the workforce and the standard of, teaching and the standard that we're producing now, I mean, the data would suggest that there's been a significant drop off in academic standards, but also in the quality of the curriculum. In a nutshell, before we sort of dig into it, what's the nub of it? We talk about the long march through the institutions. There's a bit of history here, though, isn't there, in terms of how this has happened? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated in a sense that education is rarely ever simple. There's no kind of easy answer to any of this. And when you look at what happened during the 70s and 80s, there are a couple of factors that we have to look at. One is what at the time we called the progressive education movement. Now, that was all about child-centered learning, about process, about inquiry-based. You don't have academic studies, you don't have exams and competition. You want everyone to be a winner, so you get rid of exams where kids fail, for example, and the teacher no longer teaches, they're no longer the authority figure. They become like a facilitator. So part of it is this progressive education where really teachers abrogated their responsibility as authority figures, and they weren't as much worried about the knowledge, the key knowledge in the various subjects. Along with that, we had what I call the Long March, which goes back to the Cultural Revolution of the late 60s, even further back to the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 20s and 30s. And what that was a very cultural Marxist view. Schools had to be taken over to become vehicles for the revolution. And so at the same time we had this dumbing down, this progressive education, we also had this very strong cultural Marxist view. And that was in America, England, Australia. There was a whole deschooling movement. So you got rid of inspectors, you got rid of academic studies, you got the idea that you had community schools. And it was quite a radical time in terms of the impact it had. So whether it was the Australian Education Union, the Association Teachers of English, teacher training, it all became very much skewed towards this cultural Marxist view, progressive view, away from what I call a more classical liberal view of education, which is something that I grew up with. So we've had a fundamental change that started happening during the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, it's clearly rolled out through, and presumably the students from that era then went on to universities and then started running the universities and then into the corporate sector, and it sort of probably explains a lot of where we're up to and why we're up to where we're up to now, yeah, in society, where we see corporates, or at least part of the puzzle. I think corporates that are now pushing political messages rather than delivering products. I think it's certainly a lot of stemmed. It shows the importance of getting this right. Are we seeing any glimmer that we are getting that right? Is it getting worse now every year incrementally? I mean, I've seen statistics recently that I think it's Singapore lead the world in terms of their education standards, and Australia, despite spending billions and more than ever, our standards have dropped. So is there any, is the trajectory continuing to roll downhill on this?
It's been a pretty bleak or dismal story. I mean, you're dead right. After we had the Gonski Review of School Funding that Julia Gillard set up, we've invested, the taxpayer governments, state and federal territory, invested billions of dollars, but results have continued to fall in the international testing, whether it's literacy or numeracy, science, but also NAPLAN, the national testing. It really hasn't improved in any way. So it's either flatlined or gone backwards. So it's not about money. You can forget what the teacher union says. It's not about more teachers, smaller classes, more resourcing. Money is not the solution. So it really gets back to the curriculum, what it is that you're teaching, and what happens in the classroom in terms of what they call the pedagogy. What happens in the classroom, the curriculum. So they're the two critical factors we need to look at. And I've done probably 4 benchmarking projects internationally, looking at the characteristics of stronger performing education systems, mostly in East Asia, but also some in Europe, and trying to work out what it is that in Australia you can't always copy everything, but you can learn from and pick up. I mean, it's obvious to me and others now that we have some of the most disruptive, badly behaved classrooms among the OECD. So in Australia, we have a fundamental problem with discipline, unruly classrooms. That never happens in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, even in places like Europe now, whether it's Sweden or Finland. There's more disciplined classrooms. Also, their curriculum, they don't try and do everything. I mean, when I co-chaired the review of the national curriculum, it was obvious it was a mile wide and an inch deep, as the Americans would say. So we need to cut back on the curriculum. We need to have more effective pedagogy. Now, the good news is, interestingly enough, in New South Wales, under Labor, at the state level, they're starting to do some of that. So they've argued, for example, that the curriculum has to be more about subjects, knowledge. What are the basics that all kids need to learn, whether it's history or mathematics or science? They want to get rid of iPhones and a lot of the technology out of schools, and we know that doesn't work. And they want to reintroduce phonics and phonemic awareness in terms of early years of reading. And I know Sarah Henderson, the shadow education spokesman federally, she's pushing this as well. So there's a bit of a glimmer, the tide is starting to turn. And obviously, as more and more parents, more and more grandparents and employers and people like yourself, as more people are becoming aware of it, they're starting to push back against it, which is good.
We've spoken before about the national curriculum, and I think you summed it up really well, and it wasn't something that I was overly aware of at the time until you explained it. But the national curriculum really seems to have had a big impact on where we are today. Can you just explain what life was like in the education system before that, and then what it looks like now, and whether or not the national curriculum has played a bit of a role in the drop off. Ultimately, if that's something that's become important.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is, I was always against a national curriculum when it was first, introduced federally. I argued against it because I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, so I'm always a bit wary of centralising power. And once you have control over something, now, whether it's education or finance or energy, once you have this top-down approach, then you can get into trouble because it can very easily be captured. So I've always argued for greater autonomy and flexibility at the local level. And a lot of the research in America, England, and Australia, even here, shows that those schools that often do better academically, but not just that, often have greater control over their staffing, their curriculum focus, and budgets, etc. So I was never in favour of a national curriculum. I've always argued for greater subsidiarity, as I call it, greater control at the local level. And frankly, that's why a lot of Catholic and independent schools do so much better and why they're so popular with parents, because they don't have this mandated centralised control as government schools do. Now, the national curriculum, as many of your listeners, viewers would know, is very woke. I mean, instead of just focusing on the subjects, as I did when I was teaching, when I taught literature, I wasn't interested in sustainability, in Asia perspectives, in Indigenous perspectives. I taught literature. So if it was David Malouf or Henry Lawson, I taught the poem or the play or the novel. If it was Shakespeare, I talked about that. But what happened with the national curriculum, and it's been happening for the last 20, 30 years, the curriculum has become very woke. So it's all about these different politically correct ideas about victimhood, about identity politics, pushing what Geoffrey Blainey, our great historian, calls a black armband view. So it's all very pessimistic, it's all very negative. And there's a real issue here that it's actually indoctrinating generations of young people with a very nihilistic, a very bleak view of the future. I've seen young girls crying on TV at the demonstrations about climate because they say, I can't have children. We can never have babies because the world's about to end. And as you know, Senator, during the whole debate about the voice, the Australian Education Union, the Teacher Union, the AEU, they were telling teachers in the classroom that you must tell the children we were invaded, the First Fleet led to genocide. So even in the national curriculum, even though it's been there under Labor and Liberal governments, it's very woke. And that's the danger because President Lincoln many years ago said, what happens in the classroom in one generation will be policy at the government level in the next generation. And that's what's happened. And, I pick up on your point you made before, Michael Gove, who was Secretary of State for Education in the UK. He argued a lot of people, baby boomers like me, who were radicalised during the 60s and 70s, they went into media, politics, university, schools, the corporate world. So you've had a lot of, 2 or 3 generations of people who have been indoctrinated, and that is the way what I call the cultural left works. That was their strategy. They were never going to win at the barricade. They were never going to have a revolution physically. So you take the long march, family, school, universities. And that's what they've done.
And I liked you wrote in something not that long ago. I think you said that the barbarians weren't at the gate; they were inside the citadel now, and that's what we're seeing now with the education system, which is probably fair enough. And you use the term, I think, edubabble, education babble, and educrats,
Yeah.
which sort of I think touches on this whole business about the bureaucracy being huge and it feeding into the national curriculum and causing causing some of these problems. We get reports all the time of kids being, forced to, before class, do a welcome to country where nobody would ever stand and salute the flag or, the Lord's Prayer or anything anymore. So it's real. And of course, it's real in another sense that the standards have dropped off as well. I mean,
It's right.
this
just on that
must
last
be
point
having,
you make.
yeah,
Sorry to interrupt. When I went to school,
yeah, no,
we had Monday morning assembly where the flag would be raised and there would be the oath of allegiance. So I honoured the flag, faithfully served my parents, teachers, and the law. But education back then, it was more about nation building, more about a sense of patriotism. Now, I'm not saying you should go overboard, but this is a great country. I mean, we're so lucky to live in Australia. And you only have to look north to China, to whether it's Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam, North Korea. We're incredibly lucky to be in this country. But what's happened over the last 20, 30 years, that sense of nation building has been lost. So the kids will often do a welcome to country. During the whole debate about the voice, they were teaching the Uluru Statement from the Heart in classrooms. The English teachers wanted that. The teacher union wanted that. So we've actually moved away from education being balanced, impartial, fair, to this, what George Orwell calls groupthink or indoctrination. And that's in the language as well. We haven't even talked about the Safe Schools program, which was all about enforcing a Marxist, cultural Marxist belief about gender and sexuality. So for years now, even in kindergarten, little kids are being taught boys can be girls, girls can be boys, and that it's fluid, it's dynamic. You can choose. So there's a significant issue here, not just about falling standards, the way it's been dumbed down, the curriculum, but also how it's been made very cultural, Marxist, very woke. And I think it's actually appalling what is happening, especially to boys in schools, where the general feeling is boys, like their fathers, are misogynist or violent. And there was one school in Melbourne where boys were made to stand up at assembly and apologise to the girls, which I think is just bizarre.
I get a lot of complaints now about consent training being used as a vehicle in the same way, being introduced in schools through either the curriculum or through outside programs, which sometimes are brought in. So I think that's the concern for parents. I mean, what are they to do if in the current climate you're sending your child to let's say a primary school, a public primary school. You've got to work within the parameters that you have. What do parents do if they're worried about their children being, not being taught the right things and not being educated to a proper standard? What's the angle to this?
Well, I mean, first of all, and I've always argued, as many others do, that parents are the primary caregivers and moral guardians. And, when you look at this whole debate about religious freedom for schools, go back a step. All the international covenants and agreements and the way Western democracies work, parents are primarily responsible for their children, not the state. It might be different in China or Russia, but not the way we live. So we have that belief that parents are primarily responsible. And parents have a duty of care. So I've always argued, parents turn off the computers, turn off the screens, don't let kids go to bed with their iPhones, read them stories when they're young, take them out to galleries, museums, get them out, physically catching a ball, kicking a footy. Parents, right from the word go, must be directly involved with their children's education. And whether that's doing times tables or reading myths and fables and legends, I mean, it's critically important because those first 4 or 5 years, that's when you're laying the groundwork. So number one, parents have to be involved daily. And I know that's hard now. A lot of parents, they're two income and they're stressed and but you've got to make the effort. The other thing, they have to find out what's happening in the school and have the courage to go up and talk to the teacher or the principal and say, well, look, I'm not happy with this. I met some great mothers in Adelaide a couple of months ago for the kids. They've organised that. And these mothers are taking that step. They're going up to schools, talking to people, finding out what's going on. And if they disagree, they tell them and say, this is not good enough. And I agree with what they're doing 100%. So parents need to get involved with the school, but they also need to be active in the public arena, in the public space. Now, whether it's talking to politicians, signing petitions, whether it's setting up web pages, writing to newspapers, parents must do that as well. And one of the things where I'm becoming more positive, the last couple of years, I've organised forums in Melbourne, Sydney. Hopefully we'll have one in Brisbane this year, where parents around Australia and teachers are starting up their own schools. So they've already established schools or starting their own based on a more classical liberal view of education, where instead of indoctrination and propaganda and cultural Marxist ideology, they actually want to give their children and students a strong academic, moral, emotional, and spiritual grounding. Because, education is crucial, it's critical. And what troubles me as an educator is that Australia has some of the highest rates of young people, self-harm, depression, anxiety. When you look at all the negative impact of digital technology, whether it's sexting or cyberbullying. It's a different world to when I grew up, and young people find it very, very difficult. And what I'm really keen for these parents to do, starting their own schools, is to ensure that what happens in the school, the curriculum, whether it's history, music, literature, teaching about religion, that it gives kids that solid grounding so that they've got the resources to draw on when things go wrong. And, if you don't have that, and we all know, Senator, that, if you get through life untouched, you've won the lotto. But you guarantee something's got to go wrong somewhere. So the question then becomes, what do you draw on to deal with that? And it's not just academic ability, it's also that emotional and spiritual. So, it's not just the question of, what I disliked about the national curriculum when I reviewed it and travelled around Australia. A lot of these experts, bureaucrats, said, we have to teach 21st century learning. We have to teach competencies and skills, working in teams, being creative. Now, all well and good, but all the research shows that that never happens until you know something. You actually have to have been taught something first. So once it's been taught, once you know it automatically, and that's where learning times tables, memorization, repetition is critical. Once you've internalized it, memorized it, then you can be creative. Then you can do more difficult things. It troubles me. I see a lot of kids, when I was teaching, young boys in particular, who couldn't read because they'd never been taught phonics and phonemic awareness. And that's leading to classroom problems because kids become behavioural problems. So it's all interrelated. There's no easy solution, but I'm optimistic that a lot more parents and teachers are starting to realise what needs to be done.
And can I just ask you, as a sort of as we wind up, the path to the future? If you're a legislator in this country, what does the path look like to getting back to where we used to be in teaching basics, as you say, in an impartial manner and making sure that the results are all good? Is that a state issue? Is it a federal issue, or is it both? And how do we do it?
Yeah, that's a $100 question. And when I reviewed the national curriculum, I actually went back over the last 40, 50 years in Australia and other places. looking at curriculum development. So, I mean, number one, if it's not working, don't keep doing the same thing. So the reality is we've tried all these approaches in Australia. We've had, state approach, federal approach, we've had top-down approach, we've had community school. I mean, there's no simple answer. But if I was in charge, what I'd be doing straight away is cutting back the national curriculum to 60% of what it currently is. So I'd say to schools, you can do 60%, maybe 3 days a week, national curriculum. The other 2 days a week, you work it out at the local level with your community, with your teachers. What you do in Wodonga is going to be different to what you do in Perth, what you do in Melbourne, what you do in, different communities, different localities, different industries. So I'd cut back to 60%. I'd actually give schools greater control, subsidiarity, with an overview. So you need to keep an eye on it. But I'd say to principals, well, look, at the school level, you can have greater control over discipline, over employing staff, over wages. I'd get rid of the sort of teacher union, the national or the state enterprise agreements, which are just a way of the teacher union to sort of look after itself. So I'd give schools greater autonomy. I'd cut back on the curriculum. It's a matter of trying to free up the system. And there are a lot of good examples. They call them free schools in England or city academies. In America, they're called charter schools. Even New Zealand is starting to do it. And certainly when I look at the overseas research, what's happening is by getting rid of the bureaucracy, the red tape, because what you have to understand is schools are drowning in red tape and bureaucracy from the federal government and then the state and territory governments. So there's a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy. So what I'd be doing is looking at best practice, to use the cliche, overseas, charter schools, free schools, and giving schools greater freedom and autonomy. And I'd certainly free up teacher training. So I don't believe everybody who works in a school has to do a 4-year teacher training degree, because most of them are going through and not coming out with any real ability to be effective teachers.
Yeah, and we know a lot of the teachers are as frustrated as we are as well. Of course, not everybody is is okay with all of this. So there's certainly there'll be a lot of cheers for that, I'd say. And of course, the issue of removing the red tape just applies everywhere. It's almost the answer to every question of what's wrong in this country is getting rid of the bureaucratic mess. I suppose it's at the top of it. It's been fascinating. It's just there's so much more to cover, but I know we're a bit short on time. Importantly, you've got a whole heap of writing that you've done. Where can people find out more? Your website, www.kevindonnelly.com.au, and I think you've also got now Instagram. What's the Instagram handle, and how do they find out more?
The easiest thing is to go to the webpage, as you said, kevindonnelly.com.au, and there are links there to all the articles I've written, basically. I write a lot for the newspapers, for Quadrant, Spectator. So there's an easy link where you can just click on that. It'll get the articles. The latest books have sold out. So I'm in the process of doing a new book, which I'll hopefully have published in about maybe a month. And I'll let you know about that. Senator Jacinta Price has written the foreword. So, yeah, there's a lot there to do. But if people look at the webpage, that'll be the easiest way to track what I'm doing.
Yeah, there's lots of information there. Thanks once again, Dr. Kevin Donnelly. Thanks for joining us on Based, and thanks for all your hard work in a difficult and contested space. People like me looking for resources really appreciate it. So thanks for everything.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.